It was the beginning of fall when my friends and I decided to spend the weekend exploring the old Bell Farm in Adams, Tennessee. Adams is a small town known for its rich history and southern charm, but it's also infamous for its haunted past. The Bell Farm, with its overgrown fields and crumbling barn, was the heart of one of the most chilling ghost stories in American folklore, the legend of the Bell Witch. The Bell Witch is a tale rooted in the early 19th century. It's said that John Bell and his family, who settled in the area in the early 1800s, were tormented by a malevolent spirit that became known as the Bell Witch. The spirit was said to be responsible for strange noises, physical attacks, and ultimately, the death of John Bell himself. The story of the Bell Witch has fascinated and terrified people for generations, and we were eager to experience the legend firsthand. We arrived at the old Bell Farm just as the sun was beginning to set. The farm was a sprawling expanse of land with a dilapidated house and barn standing as the only remnants of its once thriving past. The property was overgrown with weeds, and the tall, dense trees seemed to close in on us as we made our way to the house. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, giving the scene an otherworldly feel. The Bell House, now a shadow of its former self, was a two-story wooden structure with peeling paint and broken windows. The porch sagged under the weight of time, and the front door creaked ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the house was musty and dark, with cobwebs draped across the corners and old furniture covered in dust. It felt as though we had stepped back in time, and the oppressive atmosphere made it clear that this place had seen more than its share of sorrow. We set up our base camp in what was once the main living area. We had brought along some flashlights, an old journal we found detailing the Bell Witch legend, and a few snacks. As we gathered around, we couldn't help but feel the weight of the story hanging over us. We decided to start our night by reading from the journal, hoping to understand the history and perhaps connect with the spirit. The journal described strange occurrences, inexplicable noises, like scratching and knocking, eerie, disembodied voices, and physical attacks on the Bell family. It was said that the Bell Witch had a particular vendetta against John Bell, often targeting him with harsh, sometimes violent pranks. The more we read, the more the atmosphere seemed to thicken with an unspoken tension. As night fell, we ventured outside to the old barn, where many of the most unsettling events were said to have occurred. The barn was even more decrepit than the house, its roof partially caved in and the walls riddled with holes. The wind howled through the gaps, making the barn creak and groan as if it were alive. We set up a few more candles and prepared to conduct a small seance, hoping to contact the Bell Witch. The wind outside picked up, rattling the barn's loose boards and causing the candles to flicker erratically. We gathered in a circle, holding hands and trying to remain calm. Ella, our resident ghost enthusiast, led the seance, calling out to the Bell Witch and asking if she was present. At first, nothing happened. The wind continued to howl, and the barn seemed to settle into a relative calm. But then, a sudden, sharp noise pierced the silence. It sounded like a loud bang followed by scratching, as if someone, or something, was dragging its fingers along the walls. The noise came from the far corner of the barn, where the old stalls stood in dark silhouette. We exchanged nervous glances, our breaths visible in the cold night air. The scratching noise grew louder, more persistent, and the candles flickered wildly. The atmosphere was electric, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to peer into the darkness, but the shadows were too dense to make out any details. Just then, a cold draft swept through the barn, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. The scratching noise stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. We scrambled to relight the candles, but the wind was relentless, making it nearly impossible. When the candles were finally lit again, we saw that the barn had changed. The walls seemed to have new scratches and gouges, as if something had been clawing at them. We felt a sudden, intense cold that made us shiver, despite the warm night outside. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I could sense an unseen presence surrounding us. Ella, her voice trembling, suggested we head back to the house. We quickly packed up our things and made our way through the dark fields, the wind howling around us and the trees creaking as if whispering secrets. The shadows seemed to follow us, and the sense of dread was almost palpable. When we finally reached the house, we huddled together, trying to shake off the lingering fear. The night felt endless, and every creak and groan of the old house seemed to echo the sinister presence we had encountered. We spent the rest of the night in uneasy silence, each of us trying to make sense of what we had experienced. As dawn approached, we packed up and left the Bell farm, our minds filled with the haunting memories of the night. The bell which had made her presence known, and the experience left us all deeply unsettled. The farm, with its dark history and eerie atmosphere, had given us a glimpse into a legend that was more than just a story. It was a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that can linger long after the past is gone. The Bell Farm remains a poignant chapter in the history of Adams, Tennessee. The legend of the bell which continues to captivate and terrify those who dare to seek out its truth. Our night at the farm was a stark reminder that some stories are not just folklore, they are warnings of the dark and mysterious forces that lie just beyond our understanding. It was a dreary October evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old Whitmore mansion on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. Savannah is known for its charm, historic architecture, and vibrant culture, but it's also infamous for its ghost stories and haunted locales. The Whitmore Mansion, with its decaying grandeur and eerie reputation, was the perfect setting for a Halloween adventure. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, its once beautiful facade now covered in ivy and grime. The front porch sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were boarded up, giving it a menacing, derelict look. The stories about the mansion were legendary around Savannah. They spoke of a tragic figure, Mary Whitmore, who had lived there in the early 1900s. Mary was said to be a stunning beauty with a tragic fate. Her life was cut short under mysterious circumstances, and local legends claimed her spirit haunted the mansion, seeking vengeance for her untimely death. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. We parked our old pickup truck on the side of the road, the engine's purr fading into the distance as we approached the mansion. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay, and the wind rustled through the skeletal trees, adding an unsettling soundtrack to our adventure. Inside, the mansion was even more unnerving. Dust-covered furniture and cobweb-laden chandeliers gave the place a forgotten feel. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. We made our way to the grand ballroom, where we planned to conduct a seance and test the legend of Bloody Mary. As we set up our gear, a couple of flashlights, an old Ouija board, and some candles, I could feel the tension in the air. The ballroom was a vast, open space with high ceilings and broken windows that allowed the night breeze to whip through. The chandeliers overhead were mere skeletons of their former selves, hanging precariously from the ceiling. We lit a few candles and placed them on an old, cracked table in the center of the room. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere ripe for ghostly encounters. My friend Josh, always the skeptic, joked about how we were all getting spooked over nothing, while Ella and Lisa, true believers, looked more than a little nervous. With everything set, Ella suggested we try summoning Bloody Mary. The idea seemed ridiculous at first, but with the night's eerie vibe, it felt oddly appropriate. Ella took a deep breath and positioned herself in front of a tarnished mirror that we had found in the corner. The mirror was small and grimy, but it still reflected the candlelight in a dim glow. "All right, here we go," Ella said, her voice shaking slightly. She began to chant, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." We all stood around the mirror, the silence in the room growing heavier with each repetition. The first few attempts felt like a harmless prank. But as we chanted, the room grew colder. The candle flames flickered wildly, and the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. I could see my breath misting in the air, a stark contrast to the relatively warm evening we had left outside. The mirror's surface began to ripple, and a dark, shadowy figure started to form. The figure was that of a woman, her face partially obscured by a veil of blood, and her eyes were wide with a mix of rage and sadness. Her expression was one of pure torment, and her gaze seemed to pierce right through us. A chill ran down my spine as the figure in the mirror reached out, her blood-stained hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. The room was filled with an icy draft that made us shiver uncontrollably. My heart raced, and I could feel the weight of fear pressing down on me. "Guys, this isn't funny anymore," Josh said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was visibly shaken, his usual bravado completely gone. Ella, who had started the chant, was now frozen in place, unable to look away from the mirror. The figure's eyes were locked onto hers, and I could see the terror reflected in Ella's face. Lisa and I exchanged worried glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. The candle flickered out suddenly, plunging us into darkness. The mirror was now a pitch-black void, and the cold in the room seemed to intensify. We could still feel the presence of the spirit, a palpable weight that seemed to press down on us from all sides. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our panicked breathing. After what felt like an eternity, Lisa managed to relight the candle. The mirror was once again reflecting our terrified faces, but the figure was gone. The room slowly warmed up, but the feeling of dread lingered. We quickly gathered our things and made our way to the door. The mansion seemed even more oppressive as we left, the shadows appearing to follow us. As we stepped outside into the cold night, the rain had turned into a heavy downpour. We sprinted to the truck, our fear palpable and our hearts racing. Once we were back on the road, heading away from the mansion, we couldn't shake the feeling that we had stirred something that was better left undisturbed. The experience left each of us haunted, and in the weeks that followed, we all experienced unsettling occurrences. Strange noises, flickering lights, and a general sense of being watched became common in our homes. The Whitmore mansion was eventually torn down, and new developments replaced the old structure. But the legend of Mary Whitmore, the tragic figure who became Bloody Mary, continued to linger in the memories of those who had dared to confront her spirit. The story of that Halloween night became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power of local legends and the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. The mansion is gone, but the chilling encounter we had with Bloody Mary remains vivid in our minds. It taught us that some stories are more than just folklore, they're warnings of the forces that lie just beyond our understanding. I remember the night I first encountered the Wendigo as if it were yesterday. It was late January, and my friends and I had decided to spend the weekend camping in the wilderness near Munising, Michigan. Munising, a small town on the shores of Lake Superior, is renowned for its striking winter scenery and dense, foreboding forests. We had chosen a remote site near the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, a spot famous for its rugged beauty and ancient forests. The snow had been falling heavily for days, blanketing the landscape in a thick, soft layer that glistened under the moonlight. The air was frigid, and the wind howled through the tall pines, creating an eerie soundtrack to our adventure. After setting up our tents and starting a fire, we gathered around it, trying to warm ourselves against the biting cold. We roasted marshmallows and shared stories to pass the time. One tale that surfaced was about the Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore. According to the legend, the Wendigo is a monstrous entity with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. It's said to be a gaunt, emaciated being with glowing eyes and a terrifying, unnatural hunger that drives it to devour those who cross its path. The stories spoke of its ability to possess people, turning them into Wendigos themselves, adding another layer of horror. We laughed off the legend, dismissing it as just another spooky story meant to unsettle campers. But as the night wore on, the temperature plummeted further, and the winds howling grew louder and more relentless. We were huddled close to the fire, trying to ignore the unsettling sounds of the forest when we heard it, a deep, guttural growl emanating from the darkness. It was unlike any sound I'd ever heard, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to resonate from the very earth beneath us. My friends tried to reassure me, but the growl was enough to send chills down my spine. The noise was followed by a series of sharp, scratching sounds, like something large and heavy was moving through the snow and brush just outside our camp. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured towards the source of the noise, my heart racing with every step. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and snow. Yet, the sense of being watched was overpowering. Then, one of my friends yelled, pointing towards a shadowy figure emerging from the forest. The figure was tall and emaciated, with limbs that appeared elongated and unnaturally thin. Its eyes glowed a sickly, unnatural green, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, predatory teeth. The sight was enough to freeze my blood. We scrambled back to the fire, panic setting in as the creature's growls grew louder and more persistent. We could hear its footsteps crunching through the snow, growing nearer with each passing moment. In a state of sheer terror, we packed up our gear as quickly as we could and decided to make a run for it. The trek back to our vehicle was treacherous. The wind howled with such force it felt like it was pushing us back, and the snow made every step difficult. The growls of the Wendigo seemed to follow us, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. We caught glimpses of its glowing eyes through the trees, and its haunting growls echoed through the forest. Every so often, we'd stumble over hidden tree roots or slip in the snow, our breaths misting in the frigid air. The fear was palpable, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we pushed forward. We had to keep moving, driven by the primal urge to escape whatever was pursuing us. Finally, after what felt like hours of stumbling through the snow and struggling against the wind, we reached the trailhead where our truck was parked. It was a small clearing off M28, the main highway that cuts through the wilderness. We threw our gear into the back of the truck and jumped in, locking the doors with trembling hands. As we started the engine and drove away, the growls of the Wendigo seemed to fade into the distance, but the terror remained. The creature's haunting presence had left an indelible mark on me. Even as we drove through the snow-covered roads, I could still hear those chilling growls echoing in my mind, a constant reminder of the nightmare we had barely escaped. When we finally reached the safety of a small motel in Munising, we were exhausted and shaken. The warmth of the room was a welcome relief, but the memory of that night haunted us. We spoke little about the encounter, each of us grappling with the terror in our own way. To this day, I can still hear that guttural growl in my nightmares. The Wendigo was more than just a story, it was a real and terrifying presence that I will never forget. The experience taught me that some legends are not merely tales meant to frighten, they are warnings of very real dangers that lurk in the darkest corners of the world. The Wendigo, with its insatiable hunger and malevolent presence, left a mark on my soul, and I know I'll never look at the woods the same way again.